So, just looking back in the history of the Irish in Illinois, um, I what I really liked in your book is I really liked there were all these like the little like pull out sections of
Hmm.
how did the Irish become democratic in Illinois,
Right.
which is kind of really interesting because even down here in Springfield, everybody that's Irish is very democratic, and
Hmm.
yet our state rep is Tim Butler, and his grandfather was in the legislature. There were Butlers from Ireland, and his family's all Republican out of Peoria.
Right. And I mean, it is a complicated story, and it's one that it's not something that's inevitable, I guess. And
Hmm.
I wrote this with my former PhD student who's now a professor at University of Indianapolis, Matt Billings. And Matt did a lot of work on like that material right there, for example.
Hmm.
He did a lot of work on the 19th century kind of politics stuff. And one of the things his work always emphasized is there's nothing inevitable about the Irish becoming democratic.
Hmm.
That's the way it played, and it might have always been the most likely story because of the way political parties were in the 1840s and 50s and down through the years.
Hmm.
Um, but they did, there are a lot of people who are toyed with being Republican. And I think if you looked at the numbers today, even, for all your sample there in Springfield, if you looked at the Chicago suburbs and around the collar counties and all of that, there are a lot of Irish Americans, people
Hmm.
who consider themselves Irish, et cetera, who would have voted both Democrat and Republican over the last 25 years,
Yeah.
or since Reagan,
Hmm.
um, I mean, the Reagan family is an interesting example, as we have in the book, right?
Hmm.
So they were dyed-in-wool Democrats in Dixon and in North Central, Northwestern Illinois,
Hmm.
and then that seems to have changed
Yeah, a
as
little
it
bit.
1950s and beyond. So these things do change, and I think one of the things the book tries to do with things like that is by charting this longer story, you can kind of get a hold of the bigger picture and some of the
Hmm.
complexity that goes into it that enriches it. It makes it a lot more interesting than if you just have these kind of black and white pictures. It's interesting that you drew out the little the cutouts and stuff because that's something we did a lot of little mini biographies in the
Hmm.
book in those spaces, and the idea was to kind of allow um, readers to kind of get, a human portrait,
Hmm.
while they're doing this big history, but yet they can connect with individuals and also to highlight some people that don't get emphasized that much. So, we have a lot of those inserts are on women, for
Hmm.
example, who've been ignored in treatments of the Irish and the Illinois,
Hmm.
which tend to focus on the political
Political.
machine and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's kind of when you first think of Illinois and Irish people, you immediately think of Chicago. You think
mhm,
of Southside Chicago parties and the parade and
right.
the Southside Irish mob, and it's and then of course the Daley family, how and the Democratic Party just out of Chicago, the quote Chicago machine,
And
and
it's
like I said, that kind of it's just like that is all that you really think about, and you don't really see like I really like going back to like talking about all the canal workers and strikes and that sort of stuff. You don't really see the everyday person in a lot of history like that. You see the politicians, you see the mobsters, and then everyday
mm.
name makers.
Well, and those are great stories, and we try and tell some of those stories in the book,
Hmm.
and I don't talk as much about the dailies as I do someone like Ed Kelly,
Hmm.
who, so I try and get at in the 20th century material, we tried to get at the machine stuff that way rather than kind of
Hmm.
through the dailies, although there's plenty of material on the dailies,
Oh yeah.
etc. But yeah, back to your point, I mean, I those are great stories and they're really important. And the machine is the history of the so-called machine is complicated, rich, and really interesting.
Hmm.
And we try and tell it because it's a lot more interesting than I think people tend to see it now when they see it because it's like the bad thing right now. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
looks through that
Yeah.
lens,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
through all the criticism of Madigan or the dailies and all that. But to the earlier point, we tried to. I mean, the history of the Irish in Illinois is very long-standing and diverse, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not just about the politicos who ran Chicago. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't really run Chicago as well. That's a really critical point. I mean, is that
Uh-huh.
the machine was all about coalition building and depended on relationships between the Irish and other white ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
And Kelly and Daley and all those guys never get elected if it's not for the black vote, in
Mm-hmm.
Chicago. So African Americans are the key cog,
Mm-hmm.
so there's a complexity and some ironies there in the machine. But we like to tell, I mean, this longer history is a lot more interesting. The everyday histories, the histories of canal workers who were much more involved in politicking and important events in
Mm-hmm.
the 1840s and 50s and beyond than people might know. Lots of interesting stories about nuns, about
Mm-hmm.
women who did some pretty remarkable things in terms of service for working class and people who were suffering,
Mm-hmm.
not just in Chicago, but across the state. And yeah, I think, as I'm guessing, if you're from a small town with the red hair and all that, we're trying to, this really is the first statewide history of the Irish in Illinois, and not
Mm-hmm.
just make it about the Irish in Chicago. Even though, again, I don't, there's really rich stories
So
and
much
great
stuff.
stuff. It's
Yeah.
just so important to give voice to that stuff as well. But there are Irish experiences outside of Chicago that are
Mm-hmm.
worth telling and important to tell. And it's a lot harder, I think. So, one of the things Matt and I wanted to do is encourage people, future researchers, people who are grad students now, to go out and do that work.
Mm-hmm.
People who to tell stories of women, Irish women in Bloomington, for example,
Exactly.
or in Southern Illinois, or place like that, to go out. And so this book is in part designed to get people moving, to get,
Mm-hmm.
to just to inspire and get people to do some more.
Do you think the way that everything has been evolving since the Victorian period, the 1900s, and then post-war, obviously the Irish Catholics are very democratic.
Mhm.
Um, do you see the sectarian religion playing into the differences as it got further and further to our time, or did that really peter out after, the 1840s, 1850s?
I think it's much less significant.
Hmm.
Certainly times change, and the issues that kind of divide and connect people shift with the times. So there's no doubt that religion is a very important marker of identity
Hmm.
um, for Irish people and others in the United States, just globally. But we're
Hmm.
talking about the United States here. Let's limit ourselves there.
Yeah.
It's big enough. So there's no doubt that religion is an incredibly important marker of identity, and continues to be important in people's lives. So if you polled Irish Americans in Illinois now, I would be you'd find that religion is an important part of
Hmm.
their lives. Although I think Irish people are less associated with the Catholic Church than they might have been in the past. They're more
Hmm.
spread out across
Exactly.
different denominations and religions. But yeah, there's no doubt that religion was an incredibly important marker in the 19th century,
Hmm.
but it becomes less so in the 20th century as the Irish as ethnicity, while remaining important. The Irish people in Illinois still feel and articulate a connection with Ireland, but they're also become more homogenized Americans too.
Hmm.
The integration that you see, in particular, I think in the 30s, 40s, and after World War II, you see more and more of that. So I don't think religion becomes it's not as much a important dividing line
Hmm.
after, say, 1920 or so.
Yeah. Um, the the other thing that I've always found really fascinating is, we obviously being here in Illinois, we were firsthand uh, witnesses when Barack Obama got elected as president. That was a
Okay,
huge
yeah.
thing, obviously. And then uh, something I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about was, you know, really John F. Kennedy's election and the rise of the Kennedys and Camelot and Jackie and all of that really brought up the Irish community as being more, I guess, acceptable
Mm.
and within the ethnicities that you weren't like, oh yeah, I'm Irish and I'm this or whatever. I mean, people were like, yes, I'm Irish now. I'm identifying more as Irish American. And I don't know if, that's really the Irish communities, especially here in Illinois, if that's really the Irish communities like Barack Obama moment
Mm.
to where we became more like that was it. We're finally acceptable now.
We've made it.
We've
Yeah.
made it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there is a sense in that. I wouldn't want to do too much on that, but there is certainly, when Kennedy's elected, and Chicago played a key, critical role in that.
Yeah.
We want to get the dailies back in the conversation there. Um, there is no doubt that people nationwide and internationally, I would say, and people in Ireland as well, that Irish Americans took a special pride in that, and it
Hmm.
it definitely has. There is a sense of kind of, look, we made it. As a historian, I'm going to dial back that a little bit because I
Hmm.
think it is an historical process, and there's no doubt that, if you look at the 1850s and 1860s, these longer histories, the Irish people were discriminated against. There's no
Hmm.
doubt about it, although not as much as Irish Americans tend to celebrate in their kind of histories of being discriminated against.
Hmm.
So it's not, but there's no doubt that the vast majority of Irish immigrants who came to Illinois were working class people who had it tough.
Hmm.
And if you go back to the 1850s, 60s, 70s, you can definitely see that the process of kind of rising up the social ladder was a hard one. It was challenging, and it took a lot of time. And there is a sense, though, that kind of integration, assimilation, that Irish people were being more successful, by the 1880s and 1890s.
Hmm.
You have kind of an Irish American mayor of Chicago in the 1890s. You have Irish peoples coming in. I mean, Ed Kelly is mayor.
Hmm.
Sorry, yeah, sorry, mayor of Chicago in the early 30s after assassination there, and then you have the creation of the machine. So it is a longer, more gradual process, and Irish people are in positions of authority and doing pretty well. Um, Certainly by the turn of the century, although a
Hmm.
lot of Irish people are still struggling and working through labor unions to
Oh
enact
yeah.
change. But you know, there are Irish people who are certainly part of the establishment
Hmm.
by the 30s, let's
Yeah.
say at the very least. Um, but yeah, there's no doubt also though that Kennedy's election was a symbolic public kind of announcement.
Hmm.
And it's not just in, the St. Patrick's Day parades in the 50s start becoming an official kind of part of Chicago public life,
Hmm.
both the official and then obviously later you reference the South Side stuff. Um, you
All
could look
Southside.
at the academic organization I'm primarily part of, the American Conference for Irish Studies, is
Hmm.
created in the early 60s as an effort to kind of get Irish studies into the academic establishment.
Hmm.
So there's no doubt that even as late as 1960, there was a sense that Irish Americans had a bit of a sense that they got to push in. And so
Hmm.
there would have been a sense that Kennedy's election was a marker of we've made it, we're
Hmm.
now on stage. Although the historical processes were much longer, more
Yeah.
complicated,
Hmm.
and you know, there had been kind of very successful and powerful Irish people for the last 80 years before
Hmm.
that. But
So
yeah,
when do you,
it's interesting. In the book, we look at one of the things I learned in writing this book is, because you have to. I'm primarily trained as a 19th century Irish historian, and my co-author is the one who's more focused on Irish America.
hmm.
But I had to learn a lot to co-write the book with him,
Hmm.
so I honed up on my 20th century Irish American history, learned a lot about America and Illinois. There's all these really interesting spaces, like if you look at movies about World War II, World War
Hmm.
II movies reflect this notion of kind of ethnics coming together in a common kind of white American
Okay. Hmm.
identity. And, there's no doubt that some of those reflect kind of acceptance of Irish Americans as Americans by the 30s and 40s. So
So are you thinking, if I were to ask the question, when do you think Illinois really got on the map as far as Irish people are white people? Like we finally got that. When did the Irish become white?
I think the Irish were white when they landed on the shores,
Yeah.
and I think we advanced that argument, and
Hmm.
um, it's not. There certainly is anti-Catholic and anti-Irish sentiment and
Hmm.
discrimination, which we detail in the book. So you can find that
Yeah.
in particular ferocity in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and that time period, and in reaction to when famine immigrants come. But one of the things that we emphasize in the book is that, you know, the Irish immigrants, as much as in a class sense, and we do kind of focus on class as a variable, an important variable. Some working class Irish Americans continued to struggle and be discriminated against for decades. Um, when Irish people landed on the shores, at least in the 1830s and 40s, they could vote. And this is where, um, they could vote in places like Indiana and Illinois.
Hmm.
And as
Okay.
early as 1842, 1843, the early 1840s, you're getting sheriffs and people elected who are Irish.
Yeah.
Um, you will not find Black people getting elected.
No.
So,
No.
I mean,
So
and
it
it
got.
is to say again, so there you're squaring this. There is severe anti-Catholic discrimination in the 40s and 50s and 60s. There is anti-Irish. There is sentiment of the
Hmm.
Irish as somehow barbaric and drunks and all of this kind of stuff. But they didn't have to become white. And I think so that there is a line there that the Irish were not treated um as badly as African Americans were.
Right.
And I think race is an important marker there.
Hmm.
And in terms of white America, the Irish, well, there may have been some moments where there were grayish tones. They were on the white side of that from the beginning. So um
I obviously I grew up about 30 miles west of Springfield in a little town
oh,
that has
okay.
like 25 people in it, and went to the next town for school, and that little town only had 1,200, so small, rural area. But um I being, this close to Springfield, where everything was about Abraham Lincoln, of course. It still is here in Springfield. It's all about Abraham Lincoln growing up. But um I had always heard the stories about how much Mary Todd Lincoln hated Irish people. And then I saw where you did the mini bio on James Shields and
Hmm.
the Know Nothing parties, and then Abe and Mary sending in anonymous letters, and then coming up to actually duel with Shields. So, is it fair to say that the Lincolns were not fans of the Irish community, or
Well, I don't know that I can go into too much depth on that one. But I do remember, and this is I've written another book since then, so I must admit I'm working on aging brain cells are struggling here a little bit with some of the
yeah.
details. But I do know that I can't speak to your kind of Mary Todd stuff, but I do know that one of the points in Matt's dissertation, and he talks about Lincoln, and he's the one who put those
Hmm.
details together. Um, Lincoln does talk about Lincoln was part of a Whig party that did think. I remember he cites we have a letter in there where Lincoln says, the right sort of Irish people are going to vote for us.
Hmm.
You know, um, and so kind of a lace curtain, the richer, more successful Irish people. And this is in the 1840s, early 1850s.
Hmm.
Um, so I can't speak to Mary Todd, but there certainly are moments in the 1840s where Lincoln, who's certainly not part of the Democratic establishment, and quite the opposite, is hopeful of getting Irish votes. Um, so I don't know too much about Lincoln being anti-Irish necessarily. I haven't seen that in the readings that I have, although they were supportive of Douglas and
Hmm.
were largely a Democratic force by the time he's coming into his own as a politician. So it does a certain amount of it makes sense, but maybe it's governed more as much by political party
Hmm.
there than any kind of personal civilizing belief. That is, I don't have any recollection of Lincoln being, anti-Irish in the sense of like seeing them. He wasn't a know nothing in that sense,
Right.
right? So he did
Right.
not see them as kind of barbaric and uncivilized,
Hmm.
just voting for the wrong people.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that one's always like I said, when you're growing up and you hear all the Lincoln stories like over and over and over again, and then somebody's like, "Oh, did you know Lincoln was in a duel?" And we're
Mm.
like, "What do you mean Lincoln was in a duel?" And then you find out why,
Mhm.
and you're like, "Wow." So who's really the bad guy in this story? If you like, I don't know.
Yeah, the survival of dueling culture
Oh,
is another issue altogether, probably outside our Irish conversation here.
exactly. But uh the other question I was going to ask about was obviously there's a lot of um animosity between whites and blacks, obviously during
Mhm.
Jim Crow in the South. Um, we obviously didn't have Jim Crow laws here in the Illinois, but Illinois is not sanitized or, perfect
Mm.
pass or anything.
No,
Um,
by no means.
yeah. So, uh, were some of the, I guess, race riots that were happening in Illinois, especially like I think it's 1919
Yeah,
Chicago?
in Chicago, you have the 1919 riots. You have an early one in your town there. Springfield itself
Mm-hmm.
has a race riot, of course, a bit earlier than that.
So
Um,
does that seem to be a very much a Irish feeling like second class citizens against the African community, or is that
there's
more?
definitely Chicago's bit is the bigger one, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's been some work on Springfield and East St. Louis because there's another large one in East St. Louis. Um, but if we focus on Chicago, which is probably the in 1919, which is the big one, the most work has been done on. The Irish are disproportionately involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's just a sense of, I mean, the complexity of racism. I mean, there's just a sense belief in pretty wide sectors of the Irish and Chicago Irish community that Bronzeville and other black neighborhoods in Chicago are getting too big
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it's just a kind of sense in which people who were, I mean, they believed that black people were inferior and should
Mhm,
keep to their places, and those places should be beneath them. So there is very heavy, big evidence of Irish athletic club involvement in some of the violence in Chicago in 1919. Reagan's Colts is kind of the famous athletic club that was involved in some of the riots.
mhm.
Uh, future Mayor Daley was a member at the time, so
Oh, there we go.
he was pretty close. He was pretty close to these events. Um, one of the things in the book, though, I mean, so there's no doubt that between in Chicago, which is the main theater, but we can also look to places like East St. Louis and
Mm-hmm.
Springfield, and find Irish involvement in violence against Black people. Um, but in Chicago, there's no doubt that Irish men, in particular, Irish American men, played disproportionate, I would even say, roles in riots, in discrimination, and some of the violence meted out against Black people. At the same time, one of the things the book likes celebrates is like again the diversity of voices. So we can find
Mm-hmm.
in Chicago at the same time period, we can find writers celebrating kind of transracial alliances
Mm-hmm.
to kind of transform the city. My favorite character, probably in the book, my favorite story that I learned about is a woman by the name of Sir Mary Williams Sullivan,
Mm-hmm.
who is a daughter of Charity and Nunn, who comes to Chicago in the 1950s, St. Louis born. And she's a huge civil rights advocate, and she sets up there in both central Chicago and on the west side. And she is a huge advocate for civil rights, for better housing, for working class communities. And she fights like hell against Daley and the Machine. And she describes herself, she's the head of Marillick House, which is this settlement house on the west side.
Mm-hmm.
And she describes herself as a large Irish nun sitting on the corner of Jackson and California for her life. There are other stories where a policeman had to kind of book her after some protest, and he was shocked to have to book a nun.
Yeah.
And she said, "Well, sure. Why are you shocked?
Mm-hmm.
You're getting." So she served as an advocate. She worked with King. She worked with the Chicago Interracial Council in the 60s. She just passed away maybe about 7 or 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Did 73 years service working for education, civil rights, all this stuff. So for all the kind of daily stories and the Chicago the Chicago riots there,
Mm-hmm.
Irish involvement in East St. Louis, all this stuff, it's also important to again celebrate the kind of the diversity of the Irish experience and
Mm-hmm.
find labor advocates, nuns, like people like Mary Williams
Mm-hmm.
Sullivan, who didn't share the same vision that other people did. They didn't let the kind of resentments and changes um, describe. For most Irish people, though, they probably weren't involved either way, either
Mm-hmm.
in the violence and the kind of active anti-Black activities, and they weren't civil rights advocates who are on the front lines. Most people, and we have a bunch of quotes on this, are probably like most people, and they were
Mm-hmm.
just kind of sullen. They didn't want things to change that much, but they
Mm-hmm.
kind of bent with the wind. And then a lot of them moved out to the suburbs
Mm-hmm.
after the war, so
We're taking
that's
over.
probably more of an everyday norm. Most
Mm-hmm.
people aren't heroes. Most people are pretty just getting through their day.
Yeah.
So
So what do you see for the future of the Irish in Illinois?
I don't know. It certainly, there's a couple different things I would say to that. Certainly, it shows no sign of becoming a less important marker of identity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at Irish, you look at the various parades, you look at Irish dancing, you look at Irish
Mm-hmm.
sport, you look at Irish pubs and music and Irish theater, all these markers, continue to thrive in various ways.
Mm-hmm.
St. Patrick's Day parades are more popular than ever. Irish dancing is
Mm-hmm.
one of the huge cultural forms in the suburbs of Chicago and probably across the state. I don't know, have the numbers there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Traditional Irish music thrives. So people will continue to kind of celebrate that in identifiable ways. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's no danger of ethnic fade or anything like that. But at the same time, I think in a multiracial, increasingly inclusive society, I think Irish people have to be open to different people enjoying Irishness, and
Mm-hmm.
not be too tight on that. And we end the book with a picture of a young African American boy holding up he's at a Southern Illinois Irish Festival, holding up
Mm-hmm.
a little flag of the Irish Republic. And I put it there just because I thought it was a great kind of you that the appeal of aspects of Irish culture and Irish history are celebrated by lots of different people. And we need to kind of emphasize that and
Yeah.
celebrate
The
that and push that
diaspora
as
is
much as
diverse.
possible. Huh?
The diaspora
Not
is diverse.
Yeah, not to be exclusive and inward looking, but to be outward looking. And I think that one of the most important and powerful aspects of Irish history, and one that really can appeal to lots of people in a time like this, is the Irish were immigrants to this
Mm-hmm.
country. And they were one of the first, largest, and eventually most successful immigrant groups.
Mm-hmm.
If without Irish immigrants, are there Italian immigrants? Are there, Mexican immigrants? Are there West African immigrants? And that common immigration story is really important and powerful to stay. So
Mm-hmm.
when people ask me, why is Irish history so important today? It's, um, that's one of the things I like to point to. We are a nation of immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
and the Irish were incredible. They were forerunners of that.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think it's a common thing that should kind of be something that bonds us together, a common story that bonds us together rather than being so divisive the way it is.
Fantastic.
You know?
So,
Yeah.
alrighty. Well, thank you for your time.
Well, my pleasure. If I can,